At precisely 11:45 on the night of November 14th, my throat was choked with thick gray smoke as Julian Vance locked the reinforced glass door of our burning Aspen Lodge from the outside. He stood in the snow adjusting his camel wool coat while watching my fingernails claw against the shatterproof pane. The bitter taste of thallium poison, which he had slipped into my organic tea for 9 long months under the guise of an immune booster, paralyzed my limbs as the floorboards collapsed beneath me. When I blinked, the burning pine vanished, and the sterile smell of expensive sandalwood aftershave filled my nostrils. I was sitting in the high-back leather chair of Julian's law firm on the 42nd floor of the Boston Financial Center, holding a heavy gold-tipped Montblanc pen above page 14 of our prenuptial agreement. My fingers trembled so violently that a drop of black ink splattered onto the white parchment, looking exactly like the charred wood from my nightmare. The phantom heat of the fire still simmered behind my eyes, making every breath feel like hot ash. Across the heavy mahogany desk, Julian was adjusting his silk tie with the exact same fluid movement he used when he left me to die in the snow. He leaned forward, flashing his signature gentle smile that the Boston press often praised for its aristocratic warmth. Beside him sat his mother, Eleanor Vance, her posture rigid as she stared at me with undisguised contempt. She tapped her diamond-encrusted watch, a silent reminder that my family's crumbling logistics company, Aldridge Maritime, would face liquidation if I did not sign this contract by midnight. To them, I was just a desperate girl trying to cling to the Vance legacy to rescue her father's failing business. They did not know that I had already spent 3 agonizing years under their heel before dying in that Aspen cabin. They did not know that the prenuptial agreement they were forcing me to sign had served as my death warrant. In my previous life, Clause 14 subsection B stated that if I died or became medically incapacitated during the marriage, my father's ancestral shipping routes would automatically merge into the Vance global estate. Julian had spent 3 years ensuring that exact clause would be triggered, slowly poisoning my food and gaslighting me into believing I was losing my mind. This time, I kept my hand steady as I stared at the paper. I did not shed a tear or show the terrifying rage burning inside my chest. Instead, I looked up at the corporate attorney standing in the corner of the room, who was silently observing our interaction. I turned back to the document and did not sign. I flipped to page 14, uncapped my pen, and quietly drew a neat black line through the last 2 sentences of the critical clause. I wrote a small amendment in my neatest cursive script right next to the crossed-out text. My new amendment stated that in the event of my physical illness, hospitalization, or death during the term of this marriage, the entire Aldridge estate would immediately revert to the federal treasury for investigation. Furthermore, a full criminal forensic autopsy would be triggered at the sole personal expense of the Vance family. I signed my initials right beside the newly added handwritten clause. Eleanor's eyes narrowed immediately, and her manicured hands tightened around her crocodile leather purse. She wanted to yell at me for modifying a legal document without their prior consent. But Julian, always the proud manipulator, patted her hand to calm her down and pulled the contract toward him. He glanced at my scribbled lines and gave a soft chuckle, thinking it was merely the irrational paranoia of an insecure young woman. He did not care about the criminal investigation clause, because he was entirely confident in his ability to kill me without leaving a single trace. He signed his name with a flourishing stroke and sealed his own fate with black ink. As soon as the wet ink dried on the paper, the heavy office door opened, and a tall young man carrying a stack of corporate tax portfolios walked in. His name was Mark Sterling, a senior auditor who had recently been assigned to examine the restructuring of Aldridge Maritime. In my past life, I barely looked at him, dismissed him as a lowly clerk, and ignored the subtle warnings he tried to give me about Julian's offshore banking activities. Now, looking at his calm gray eyes, I realized Mark was the only person who had tried to save me from the burning lodge back then. He had rushed to Aspen after uncovering Julian's financial fraud, only to arrive when the cabin was already reduced to glowing embers. I watched as Mark neatly placed the files on the desk, his gaze lingering on my handwritten clause for a fraction of a second before he looked at me. His eyes held an intense curiosity that told me he knew exactly what that modification implied. He bowed his head slightly toward me, a gesture so subtle that the self-absorbed Vances did not even notice. Our partnership started right there in that silent office room, with a secret exchange of glances over a signed death trap. The next 3 months were a psychological game played in the grand mansion of Beacon Hill, The Vances treated me like a decorative ornament, bringing me to elite charities only to remind the press of my family's previous bankruptcy. Julian continued to act as the loving husband, personally bringing me a warm mug of chamomile tea every night before we went to bed. The first time he handed me the silver tray, my palms sweat so much that I almost dropped the cup on the Persian rug. The warm liquid smelled innocent, with just a faint scent of vanilla. I knew that buried beneath that sweet scent was a microscopic dose of thallium sulfate. I smiled warmly at him, took the cup, and carried it into my private bathroom, claiming I needed to wash my face first. Once the heavy wooden door was locked, I poured the liquid into a special lead-lined flask hidden inside my hollow hairspray bottle. I filled the porcelain cup with identical, warm chamomile tea from a hidden thermos I kept inside my vanity drawer. Every night, I drank the safe tea and preserved his poison in the hidden flask. I felt a twisted sense of satisfaction as I watched Julian look at my face each morning, searching for the first signs of physical deterioration. He expected me to develop chronic fatigue, brittle fingernails, and progressive hair loss by the end of the second month. Meanwhile, Mark and I were meeting secretly in the quietest archives of the Boston Public Library. He was working under the guise of compiling tax reports for Aldridge Maritime, but he was actually analyzing Julian's secret investments. We communicated through encrypted emails, avoiding any digital traces that Julian's high-tech home security could detect. Mark revealed that Julian had used his late wife's estate to fund a shell company in the Cayman Islands called Aurora Holdings. He had taken out a massive $5 million life insurance policy on me just 6 days after we signed our marriage contract. To make matters worse, my family's oldest shipping docks were already being prepared for a forced transfer to this shell company. I realized my past life was not just a simple story of domestic abuse and spousal murder. It was a cold corporate execution, calculated down to the very penny by the entire Vance family. I kept my emotions under control, ignoring the burning hatred that made my heart race every time Julian touched my shoulder. To destroy a giant like Julian Vance, I could not just run to the police with a small vial of poisoned chamomile tea. The Vances had deep roots in the city's judiciary system, and any standard criminal accusation would be quietly brushed under the rug. I had to let him proceed with his master plan and make him believe he was winning right up until the final blow. One Tuesday evening in early January, I decided it was time to test his patience. I intentionally left a fake medical report from a prominent Boston neurologist on our shared vanity table. The forged document stated that I was suffering from a rare, genetic neurological disorder that caused frequent muscle spasms and short-term memory loss. When Julian found the document, I watched his face in the mirror as his lips curved into a tiny, cruel smile. He immediately walked into our bedroom and spoke to me in his most comforting tone, suggesting we go to his family's private clinic in upstate New York for a thorough evaluation. That clinic was owned by his uncle, Dr. Robert Vance, who had signed the fake death certificate of his first wife. I agreed to his proposal, showing him the fragile, frightened face of a victim who trusted her husband blindly. I packed my small leather suitcase, but as soon as Julian left the room to start his sports car, my hands began to shake uncontrollably. A wave of raw terror washed over me as my brain relived the agonizing suffocation of the Aspen fire. The air in our bedroom suddenly felt heavy and thin, forcing me to lean against the mahogany wardrobe just to keep from falling. I could hear my own heart hammering like a trapped bird inside my chest. This was the exact date in my previous life when Julian had successfully admitted me to that isolated clinic, where they kept me heavily drugged for 2 full weeks. I forced myself to stand tall and took a deep, freezing breath. I pulled out my secure burner phone and sent a short text to Mark, telling him that the stage was set. We had to act before the car reached the state border, or I would find myself trapped in a padded room with no way out. Halfway down the interstate highway, Julian's phone buzzed with an urgent notification. He checked his dashboard screen and saw a severe security alert from his family's hedge fund account. Someone was initiating an unauthorized liquidation of $30 million in offshore assets linked directly to Aurora Holdings. Julian's face went pale under the dashboard lights, and his knuckles turned white on the leather steering wheel. He pulled the car over onto the icy shoulder of the road and immediately dialed his private broker, his voice shaking with pure panic. I sat quietly in the passenger seat, staring out at the dark snow-covered pine trees, feeling a cold sense of triumph. While he was arguing with his broker, his car phone received another call, this one from his mother's private line. Eleanor Vance was hysterical, screaming that the Federal Trade Commission was at their mansion in Beacon Hill with a warrant to seize their corporate servers. Julian stared at me in the dim light of the car interior, his eyes darting back and forth as he tried to figure out how his secret operations had been compromised so quickly. He thought he was still the supreme puppet master, completely in control of the situation. He turned the car around and drove back toward the city at a breakneck speed, abandoning his plan to lock me away in the private clinic. I kept my face blank, expressing innocent worry about our family business while secretly celebrating our first major victory. 2 days later, my heart sank when I received an urgent encrypted file from Mark. Julian had somehow managed to shift the entire liability of Aurora Holdings to my father's logistics firm by using a forged power of attorney. The SEC had issued an emergency freeze on all of Aldridge Maritime's cargo ships, threatening my elderly father with 20 years in federal prison for international money laundering. I sat in my room, staring at the financial spreadsheets, feeling the icy cold water of failure rising up to my chin. My previous knowledge of the future had failed me here, because Julian had anticipated my defensive move and set up a secondary trap that I never experienced in my past life. My chest felt tight, and my vision blurred as I realized my attempt at revenge might have destroyed my father's life 3 years earlier than before. I spent 12 straight hours locked in my study, refusing to eat or speak to anyone. Julian stood outside my locked door, offering mock comfort and whispering through the keyhole that everything would be fine if I just signed over my remaining personal voting shares to his mother. He was trying to crush my spirit, using my father's freedom as a bargaining chip to strip me of everything I owned. But I did not break. I called Mark on a secure line and told him to release the secondary package we had been saving for the ultimate blow. If Julian wanted a war of legal documentation, I would give him an absolute slaughter. The next morning, the Vance family held their annual stockholders' meeting in the grand ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton. All of Boston's elite were in attendance, drinking champagne and celebrating the impending acquisition of my family's historic shipping empire. Julian walked onto the stage, looking confident and handsome in his bespoke black tuxedo, ready to announce the final merger that would cement his legacy. His mother stood at the front table, raising her crystal glass to toast their victory. I stood near the back of the ballroom, wearing a simple navy blue silk dress and holding a mala folder in my hands. The atmosphere in the room was warm and loud, filled with the polite laughter of high society predators waiting to feed on the ruins of my family. As Julian began his speech, his presentation slides on the giant LED screen behind him suddenly flickered and went entirely dark. The cheerful murmuring of the crowd slowly died down as the screen rebooted, showing a live stream of an SEC press conference. To everyone's utter shock, Mark Sterling was standing at the podium, surrounded by federal prosecutors and forensic specialists. The live audio of the press conference echoed through the grand ballroom, silence settling over the room like a heavy winter fog. Mark announced that a massive corporate fraud scheme had been uncovered, involving fake offshore investments and systematic poisoning for financial gain. The screen behind Julian split to show highly detailed laboratory results from the Boston Forensic Laboratory. The reports analyzed the chemical composition of the thallium sulfate preserved in my lead-lined flask, alongside matching purchase records from a shell corporation controlled entirely by Julian Vance. Then, the screen displayed a copy of our signed prenuptial agreement, highlighting the specific handwritten clause I had added on our first night. That handwritten clause was now the legal key that opened the federal treasury's jurisdiction, bypassing any local influence the Vances held over the state courts. Every elite guest in the ballroom stared at the screen, and then slowly turned their eyes to Julian, their faces filled with horror and disgust. Julian looked at the screen, his mouth half open in utter disbelief, his face in all of its color in seconds. He looked toward his mother for help, but Eleanor had already dropped her glass of champagne, her face frozen in terror as 2 federal marshals stepped through the main entrance of the ballroom. I walked down the center aisle, the crowd parting before me like the Red Sea, and threw my manila folder onto the main table right in front of Julian. The folder contained a stack of notarized confessions from his uncle's private clinic, alongside old dental records of his late wife Sarah that proved she had been heavily drugged before her tragic drowning. Julian did not yell or scream, his pride still preventing him from showing weakness in front of his elite peers. He simply stared at me with pure venom, his hands shaking as the marshals walked up to him and placed cold metal handcuffs around his wrists. I leaned closer to him, smelling his expensive sandalwood cologne one last time, and spoke in a quiet whisper that only he could hear. I told him that I remembered the bitter taste of the tea, and I remembered the heavy heat of the Aspen Lodge. His eyes went wide as he finally realized that I was not just a smart girl who had figured out his secrets. He realized that I was a ghost who had come back from the grave to put him there. He was led out of the ballroom in silence, his mother sobbing behind him as she was also taken into custody as an active accomplice. The Grand Vance empire had collapsed in less than 10 minutes, and their names were erased from Boston's elite registry before the next morning. A month after the trial, I stood on the wooden deck of one of my family's cargo ships, watching the sunset over the quiet waters of Boston Harbor. The cold Atlantic wind was blowing through my hair, but my chest felt remarkably warm and free. The constant, burning phantom pain in my lungs had finally vanished, replaced by the clean, salty air of the ocean. Mark stood beside me, handing me a warm cup of coffee that carried no smell of vanilla or dangerous secrets. We did not speak of the Vances or the court cases, because those shadows belonged to a past life that was now completely dead. I took a deep sip of my coffee, feeling the warm liquid go down my throat, and smiled at the quiet future waiting for us on the horizon. Did she go far enough, or was she still too merciful? Comment justice if the ending was perfect. Comment harder if you wanted an even colder revenge. Your comments decide how ruthless the next ending should be. Like and subscribe if you want to be here for the next story. The quiet future on the horizon lasted exactly 12 hours before the next storm broke. At 6 o'clock the following morning, my phone lit up with a secure call from Mark. His voice, usually calm and composed, carried a sharp edge of alarm that immediately brought back the freezing dread of my past life. The bail hearing for Julian Vance had been quietly moved to an emergency session at 4:30 in the morning. A notoriously corrupt circuit court judge, Harrison Miller, had approved a $10 million cash bond, allowing Julian to walk out of custody on home arrest. Within minutes of his release, Julian's elite defense attorney, Silas Mercer, had filed a motion to suppress all the forensic evidence we had gathered from my private tea flask. They claimed the chemical samples were illegally obtained and could have been easily contaminated or falsified by me to force a favorable divorce settlement. My heart hammered against my ribs as I listened to Mark's explanation, my fingers gripping the edge of the kitchen counter until my knuckles turned white. Julian was not just trying to escape his prison sentence, he was actively preparing to turn the entire narrative against me. He wanted to frame me as a scheming, unstable wife who had manufactured an elaborate hoax to steal the Vance fortune. If Judge Miller granted the defense's motion to suppress the toxicology report at the preliminary hearing on Monday, our entire criminal case would evaporate before it even reached a jury. I sat down at my wooden dining table, forcing myself to take slow, deliberate breaths to quiet the rising panic in my mind. In my past life, Julian had often bragged about his financial control over Judge Miller, calling him the best investment the Vance family had ever made. He had once mentioned a private trust fund registered in the Cook Islands that was used exclusively to funnel bribes to local Massachusetts officials. I looked at Mark, who had arrived at my apartment with 3 massive leather binders of banking transcripts. We had 48 hours to find the connection between Julian's shell corporations and the corrupt judge's offshore accounts before Monday morning. It was a race against time, with my father's freedom and my own survival hanging in the delicate balance of federal banking laws. We worked through the weekend, the interior of my apartment transforming into a war room filled with colored charts and printed financial audits. Mark tracked a series of suspicious wire transfers totaling $4 million from Aurora Holdings to a generic consulting firm registered in Delaware. From that Delaware corporation, the funds were split into smaller, untraceable deposits that were physically delivered to various private bank vaults across Boston. The puzzle was incredibly complex, designed by highly paid lawyers to keep any standard government auditor from finding the end of the trail. My eyes ached from reading the endless columns of numbers on the laptop screen, and my throat felt dry with anxiety. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see the terrifying image of Julian smiling as he stood outside my burning cabin, waiting for the smoke to do its job. By Sunday night, we hit a massive brick wall. The Delaware Shell Corporation was completely protected by anonymity laws, meaning we could not officially prove who owned the underlying banking accounts without a federal subpoena. And we could not get a federal subpoena without the prior approval of the very court system that Judge Miller was currently manipulating in Julian's favor. I stood by the window, watching the cold tap against the glass, my mind racing as I looked for another way to break the deadlock. That was when I remembered a specific conversation from my past life during a charity gala at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Julian's sister Victoria Vance had drunkenly bragged to her friends about a hidden safe behind the family portrait in their Newport mansion, where they kept physical records of all their private offshore assets. She had laughed about how her brother was too paranoid to rely entirely on digital servers, which could be easily hacked by federal authorities. A cold, dangerous plan began to form in my mind, one that required me to walk straight back into the lion's den. I turned to Mark, my eyes fixed on him with a chilling determination that made him pause in his tracking. I told him that we had to get into that Newport estate before the hearing on Monday morning. Mark immediately shook his head, stating that the Newport mansion was heavily guarded by private security officers hired by Silas Mercer. If I was caught trespassing on Vance property, Julian's defense team would use it to destroy my credibility in court and have me arrested for grand larceny. I explained to him that Julian's vanity would be his ultimate downfall, because he still believed I was a fragile girl who was terrified of his power. I would not sneak into the estate like a common thief in the dark. Instead, I would walk through the front door as his legal wife, claiming I was there to negotiate a private divorce settlement and hand over my father's remaining cargo routes. Silas Mercer would advise Julian to accept the meeting, believing they could pressure me into signing away my legal rights without a lengthy court battle. Mark stared at me for a long moment, realizing that he could not convince me to abandon this high-stakes gamble. He finally agreed to assist me, on the condition that he would stay in a van parked just outside the estate gates with an open audio frequency to monitor my physical safety. At 8 o'clock on Monday morning, my black town car pulled up the long, gravel driveway of the Vance mansion in Newport, Rhode Island. The historic estate looked like an imposing stone fortress, surrounded by dead gardens and gray Atlantic waves crashing against the cliffs behind it. Two burly security guards in dark suits checked my identification before slowly opening the heavy iron gates. My hands were ice cold as I smoothed down the fabric of my tailored gray wool coat, ensuring that my tiny collar microphone was securely hidden beneath my lapel. I climbed the stone steps, each step feeling like a heavy march toward my own potential execution. The front butler, a quiet elderly man who had worked for the Vances for 30 years, opened the massive oak door and escorted me into the formal library. Julian was sitting in an armchair by the roaring marble fireplace, sipping a glass of scotch as if he did not have a care in the world. He looked thinner than before, his face showing a subtle tension around his jawline, but his dark eyes still carried that terrifying air of absolute supremacy. He did not rise to greet me, merely gesturing with his glass toward the leather chair directly across from him. He looked at my face, a slow, condescending smile spreading across his lips as he remarked that I looked remarkably healthy for someone who claimed to be poisoned. I did not sit down, instead standing near the center of the room with my leather portfolio held tightly against my chest. I told him that I was not here to play games or debate our failing marriage in front of a court. I proposed to sign a full release of all my family's remaining shipping assets and withdraw my domestic violence complaint, on the condition that he returned my father's original corporate deeds and left my family alone. Julian laughed, a dry, mocking sound that echoed off the high bookshelf walls of the library. He stood up slowly and walked over to me, stopping only a few inches away, his breath smelling of expensive peat alcohol. He asked me why he should agree to any compromise when his lawyers were already planning to throw out all my evidence by midday. He reached out to touch a strand of my hair, his voice dropping to a low, intimate whisper as he told me that I was nothing without his name. I felt an intense jolt of physical disgust, but I did not step back, forcing my eyes to lock with his with a mixture of fear and defiance. I asked him if he really believed Judge Miller's private trust account in Delaware would remain hidden forever, especially since the IRS was already starting a secondary inquiry into Aurora Holdings. Julian's smile flickered for a fraction of a second, his fingers tightening slightly around the heavy crystal glass of scotch. He stepped back and remarked that my amateur bluffing would not save me, as the offshore bank in Delaware kept no paper trails that could ever link directly to him. He arrogantly stated that the only person who possessed the master keys to the Delaware routing codes was currently sitting in this library, and he would never share them with anyone. I kept my face blank, But my heart was beating with a victorious rhythm as his words were captured clearly by the hidden transmitter on my lapel. I glanced casually at the massive family portrait hanging above the marble mantelpiece, noticing a slight tear in the velvet lining of the gold frame. That tiny physical detail confirmed Victoria's story was entirely accurate. I turned back to Julian and told him that I needed to use the private restroom in the eastern corridor before I made my final decision on the settlement papers. He waved his hand dismissively, confident that he had successfully broken my resolve, and told me not to keep him waiting too long. I walked out of the library and closed the heavy door behind me, immediately speeding up my steps as I turned the corner into the silent east corridor. The mansion was quiet, with the housekeepers busy in the upper wing and the security guards remaining at the front entrance gates. I hurried to the main hallway where the master portrait hung, my leather portfolio sliding open to reveal a small glass cutter and a universal key card that Mark had prepared for me. My fingers trembled as I reached up and carefully tilted the heavy gold frame away from the stone wall, revealing a circular digital safe built deep into the masonry. The digital safe was a high-tech model that required an access code, which I did not have. However, Mark had discovered that Julian had registered this particular safe under his first wife's maiden name, utilizing her birth date as a backup recovery pin. I held my breath as I entered the numbers representing Sarah's birthday, my heart pounding so loudly that I was sure the security guards would hear it from the lobby. A quiet click echoed through the hall, and the steel safe door swung open, revealing 3 small folders containing blue parchment papers and several physical ledgers. I did not waste time looking through them. I quickly stuffed the 3 folders into my large leather portfolio and zipped it shut. I pushed the family portrait back into its original position, wiping away my fingerprints with my silk scarf. As I turned around to walk back to the library, the heavy footsteps of Julian's security guards sounded from the end of the east corridor. I froze, my back pressed against the cold stone wall, my chest tightening as the shadow of a large guard appeared around the corner. If he caught me here with those files, I would never make it out of this Newport mansion alive. I quickly slipped into the adjoining dining room, hiding behind the heavy velvet drapes that covered the large bay windows. I held my breath as the security guard walked past the door, his heavy radio buzzing with static as he checked in with his colleague at the gate. As soon as his footsteps faded down the hall, I slipped out of the dining room and made my way toward the front entrance of the mansion. I did not go back to the library to see Julian. Instead, I walked directly out of the front doors and headed straight toward my town car. The security guard at the gate looked at me with confusion, asking why I was leaving so quickly before my meeting with Julian was completed. I kept my voice perfectly calm as I told him that my husband's legal team would follow up with the settlement papers shortly. As soon as the car doors locked behind me, I screamed at the driver to speed down the gravel driveway and head straight for the main highway. Mark was waiting in his parked van just a mile down the road, his laptop screen lit up with the audio files from my hidden microphone. I climbed into the van, panting heavily as I threw the blue folders onto the passenger seat. Mark looked at the contents of the folders, his jaw dropping as he saw detailed receipts and signed transaction slips linking Judge Harrison Miller to an offshore trust account that was funded by Aurora Holdings. The documents also included several private diaries written by Julian's mother Eleanor, which detailed her systematic bribe payments to various municipal and federal officials over a 15-year period. We drove straight to the federal court building in Boston, bypassing the local state courthouse where Julian's corrupt preliminary hearing was about to begin. Mark used his credentials as a federal auditor to secure an immediate, closed-door emergency meeting with the United States Attorney for the District of Massachusetts. The U.S. Attorney, a formidable woman named Rachel Vance who, despite sharing the same surname, had absolutely no family relation to Julian, listened to our audio recording and reviewed the blue folders. Her expression went from skepticism to absolute fury as she realized the extent of the corruption inside her own district's judiciary system. By 12:30 in the afternoon, while Julian and his expensive defense lawyer, Silas Mercer, were standing in state court, waiting for Judge Miller to officially throw out our chemical evidence, 3 federal marshals walked into the room. They bypassed the bar and handed Judge Miller a federal warrant for his immediate arrest on charges of racketeering, conspiracy to commit fraud, and accepting bribes. The entire courtroom went into an absolute uproar, with reporters scrambling for their phones and cameras. Julian stood at the defense table, his eyes wide with a combination of shock and sudden realization as the federal prosecutors walked up to him with a separate warrant. His house arrest privilege was revoked, replaced by a federal custody order under the RICO Act, which did not allow for any cash bail. Silas Mercer tried to shout an objection, but he was immediately silenced as a third warrant was served to him for active participation in the conspiracy to conceal stolen financial documents. Julian looked toward the back of the courtroom, where I was standing next to Mark, wearing a dark blue suit and holding my father's original corporate deeds in my hands. He knew that this was the absolute end of his game. His local judicial protectors were all in handcuffs, his mother was facing 10 years in prison, and his offshore financial assets were fully frozen by the federal government. He was led away through the side exit in heavy leg irons, his expensive designer shoes squeaking against the polished floor tile of the courthouse. 2 weeks later, the Boston District Court officially dismissed all the corporate charges against my father's maritime company, and his logistics ships were finally released from federal custody. My family's company was saved from bankruptcy, and our old shipping docks were once again humming with the loud, reassuring sound of cargo containers being loaded onto vessels. Mark and I stood on the viewing deck of my father's main office building in the North End, watching the grand cargo ships sail out toward the open ocean under a bright, winter sun. He handed me a simple white envelope containing my official divorce decree, which had been quickly expedited by the new presiding family court judge. I opened the document and stared at the clean, black signature line, feeling the final remaining phantom weight of my past life lift away from my shoulders. The air was crisp and freezing, but my lungs felt completely healthy, with no lingering traces of smoke or thallium to darken my thoughts. We had completely dismantled the Vance empire from its deepest roots, ensuring that Julian and his mother would spend the next 30 years inside a high-security federal penitentiary in Pennsylvania. I looked at Mark, my smile reflecting a deep, well-deserved peace that I had never been allowed to experience in my previous 3 years. He smiled back at me, his fingers gently tangling with mine as we turned our backs on the quiet ocean and walked toward our new future. The nightmare of the burning cabin had finally ended, and this time the survivor was the one who kept the final victory. Did she go far enough, or was she still too merciful? Comment justice if the ending was perfect. Comment harder if you wanted an even colder revenge. Your comments decide how ruthless the next ending should be. Like and subscribe if you want to be here for the next story.